I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but there have been transit projects which have really changed the direction of transit forever, with innovations in technology or planning that enabled new things, new service patterns, and entirely new shapes for our cities. From the original Metropolitan Railway in London originating the idea of an underground urban railway, to the New York City subway with its express trains, and the Japanese tradition of allowing suburban trains to through run into urban subways. And many of those projects emerged from Paris, from the RER to the city's modern tram system, and perhaps in the future, orbital tram trains. But in today's video, I want to talk about the project that birthed the modern metro line, and that changed how subways would be built forever. Let's take a look. This is RM Transit, a channel about public transport and its history. Consider subscribing or supporting the channel on Patreon to help me bring you more content. I jokingly said in my Paris Explained video years ago that you could kind of call the entire Paris Metro the Paris Line 1 relief network, because Paris Line 1 has needed relief through other projects and new lines so many times throughout Paris's history. There's just absolutely huge demand to travel from the northwest to the southeast of central Paris. The biggest of these projects, of course, was the RER-A, which offered huge trains that, with signaling upgrades, eventually ended up running every couple minutes and still were filled up, moving over 1 million riders every day. So in the late 20th century, Paris created the Meteor project, or the Metro Est-Ouest Rapide. This new fast metro project would turn into Line 14. But it wasn't actually inevitable. Other plans discussed at the time included new RER tunnels, for example. But what really sold Line 14 was not only could it provide this high-capacity new core line, but it also allowed underserved communities on the edges of the city to be better connected up to the metro system. Essentially, it was able to solve multiple problems at once. And it didn't just do that, but it changed rapid transit forever. For one, Line 14 isn't like the other metro lines in Paris, and it's often compared to the Victoria line in London, which I have a dedicated video on that you can check out. That's in large part because the construction of Line 14 saw Paris get its first entirely new metro line since the 1930s. Although a Line 14 did previously exist in Paris, it's been subsumed into other lines. As with the Victoria line in London, most stations on Line 14 are interchanges with other metro lines, and some key stations connect major railway termini. Because of the huge gap in metro construction before Line 14, it brought with it all kinds of new ideas and innovations that would first be tried with Line 14. Probably the most notable of these innovations was the fact that the line was designed to be fully automated and fully driverless from day one. In fact, the success of Line 14 with its automation and full platform screen doors are a big part of why Line 1 was later retrofitted with these technologies, a full century plus after it was built. And that's not to mention further automation projects like the one that's gone on Line 4. But Line 14 didn't just set itself apart in its automation, since France did have valve systems up and down the country providing automated transit service for years before Line 14 opened. What's interesting is that Line 14 is also really high capacity. Its platforms are 120 meters long, some of the longest in Europe. And its platforms and stations are far higher capacity than anything else on the Paris Metro. And the grand design of the stations with huge volumes and arched ceilings kind of harken to the RER stations built in the decades prior, which is an interesting touch. I think the capacity is really important because Line 14's automation combined with its high capacity, it's what's really unique here. There were automated people mover systems and light metros before Line 14, but I think you could argue that Line 14 was the first fully automated heavy metro line in the world, which is a pretty cool thing. But the differences in Line 14 aren't just technical, they're really fundamental to its planning, because the line took a totally different approach when it came to speed. The Paris Metro is famous for its tight stop spacings where you can often see the next station along from the platforms. But on Line 14, stations are on average over 1 kilometer apart, several times wider stop spacing than on other lines on the system. In fact, to the south of the city, stations are closer to 2 kilometers apart. This lets the line fly along at speeds that put it somewhere between the metro and the RER. And in this, you really see a different answer for express transit. While we'd previously seen solutions like New York City's express tracks, where additional tracks on the same corridor would allow for express trains to operate, with Line 14 we saw something totally different. Line 14 kind of kicked off the idea of building an entirely new express metro line that paralleled an existing line but operated on a different route, connecting at several points but not forming a quad-track rail corridor like you see with New York. Now, actually being able to build Line 14 wasn't easy, since it crosses under some of the oldest and densest parts of Paris, and it also interacts with a ton of existing metro and RER lines. And all of that meant that it had to be built very deep, with the novel at the time approach of using a giant single tunnel boring machine to create the tunnel that would carry both tracks, something that's been replicated many times since. And I'd argue that this is just another element in Line 14's modernity, that it's 100% underground, including with its garage, which is fully enclosed. What's interesting as a North American is that in large part it feels like many of the RATP's design decisions with Line 14 were shaped by design decisions made in Mexico City and Montreal. Both of these systems were actually purpose-built with the rubber tire technology that was operating all over Paris, but wasn't actually ever engineered into the design of the lines. In many ways, Line 14 feels much more like a Mexico City or Montreal metro line than it does a Paris metro line. If you're curious about the specific route, Line 14 parallels both Metro Line 1 and the RER-A, connecting to Line 1 at Gare de Lyon and Châtelet, and to the RER-A at Gare de Lyon and the huge Saint-Lazare station complex, which is a web of different metro and train stations. What's interesting though is that on both ends, Line 14 makes these big swings across the city, both to Saint-Ouen and Olympiads. This relatively unique Z shape probably helps the line pick up more cross-city traffic, since more people are going to intercept the line as they're traveling into the city. Of course, there are also tons of transit nerd goodies on Line 14. Probably my favorite of these is the gardens at Gare de Lyon, which is directly underneath the RATP's headquarters, and is also the only island platform on the line. If you've ever wondered, the announcements on the Paris Metro only mention when doors are on the left because most platforms are side platforms. There's just something so weird and wonderful about this lush garden in a giant underground space. The line's also really interesting because it lacks a big yard, and that's surprising because the service levels can go down to every 85 seconds during peak periods, which is crazy. Instead, the line has a relatively small, fully enclosed garage that only has a single track connection onto the main line, and a non-revenue track connection to Metro Line 6 south of Gare de Lyon. It was actually only in 2024 that Line 14 got a proper, very large yard of its own, which is actually just south of the runways at Orly Airport. These yards feel very familiar because they're actually quite similar to the one we saw last year on Line 15's southern section. Now, while Line 14 and its extensions aren't technically part of the Grand Paris Express project, it's clear where the metro lines that are part of the project got most of their inspiration, being high-speed, mostly underground, and fully automated. And to be fair, its expansion, which opened just before the Paris Olympics, was really about tying it in with those Grand Paris Express lines, arguably sharing the role of core of this express network with Line 15, being the diameter to its loop. To the north of Paris, Line 14 was extended one stop to Saint-Denis-Pleyel, a massive new underground interchange station at the center of the Grand Paris Express project, designed by Japanese architect Kengo Kuma, which has a totally crazy number of escalators that will connect Line 14 as well as Line 15, including with a cross-platform transfer for passengers traveling north and then clockwise on Line 15, as well as acting as the western terminus of Lines 16 and 17. The station also came along with a massive bridge, which can take passengers over the big rail yard that it's located next to the RER-D stop, Stade de France Saint-Denis, as well as allowing passengers to make that connection to the Stade de France, which was the main stadium for the Paris 2024 Olympics. Meanwhile, to the south of the line, a new 12-kilometer extension with 6 new stations was opened, with the 7th station, an interchange with Line 15, likely set to open whenever Line 15's southern section does. And the other new stations mean a lot of new connections as well, including with the RER-C, Tram 3A, Tram 7, and the first connection of the Paris Metro to a Paris area airport, in this case to Orly, which will be supplemented by future connections to Charles de Gaulle International Airport by Line 17, which connects to Line 14, as you already know, at Saint-Denis-Pleyel. The new stations are certainly nice, and their above-ground headhouse buildings are very attractive. But the stations do feel boxier, brighter, more utilitarian, and just less grand than the other stations on Line 14, including Saint-Denis-Pleyel for that matter. Now, the inspiration spread from Line 14 hasn't been for Paris alone. Around the world, since Line 14 opened, we've seen numerous other fully automated high-capacity metro lines, often with the involvement of many of the same players that helped to create Line 14. From the Sydney Metro to various new lines in Santiago, Sao Paulo to Shanghai, and all kinds of cities in between, automated metros have become pretty much the de facto norm for new lines. So Line 14 truly didn't just change Paris, but was an inflection point for subway building globally. As we transition to more automation, higher speeds, higher capacities, and greater international standardization. And I think that's really interesting. Thanks for watching.